Are you guys talking about the hey, good evening, ladies and gentle drunks. Welcome to the fourth dimension. Big book study, that is. My name is Kevin Olson. I'm a recovered alcoholic. I'm very, very pleased to be here. And thank you all for joining. Let's kick off tonight, as we always do, with the set-aside prayer. For those of you who know it, feel free to say it along with me. God, please help me to decide everything I think I know about me, about my fellow man, about the 12 steps, and please allow me to gain a fresh new vision, perspective, and understanding of what you, what me, what my fellow man, and the 12 steps are all about. Amen.
Amen.
Okay. And as this is the fourth dimension big book study, I always like to read the two parts of our book that refer to the fourth dimension. So first of all, on page 8, Bill Wilson writes, I was soon to be catapulted into what I like to call the fourth dimension of existence. I was to know happiness, peace, and usefulness in a way of life that is incredibly more wonderful as time passes. Happiness, peace, and usefulness. Beautiful. Then on page 25, Bill Wilson writes that we have found much of heaven and we have been rocketed into a fourth dimension of existence of which we had not even dreamed. We are going to be catapulted. We're going to be rocketed. And for those of you who will, for the sake of tradition, everyone put one hand up like this. Everybody put another hand up like this. And everybody go, oh, yeah. Oh, that always gets a laugh out of me. Anyway, nobody laughs harder at my jokes than I do. So let's be clear. Let's be clear about that. Guys, I'm pumped. I'm really, really pleased to be here with you guys. We're starting over from the very beginning. Isn't that brilliant? And I wish I could tell you how many times. I wish we had taken more note when we first started doing this big book study. How many times we've been through it? Countless, though. Suffice to say, we have gone through this countless times, and it is always a joy. And every time we go through it, it's a new experience. Anybody here ever had the experience of, like, you read the big book and you're like, you said the line, like, I'm sure they snuck those lines in there. That line was not there the last time I read the big book. Well, of course, that's not true. What changes? We change. We change, and where we're at, and how awake we are spiritually, that's what changes. And over time, what the book means to us and the things within the book that really gravitate towards our soul and towards our spirit change. So every time we go through this, it's a new experience. And this is really, guys, it's not a, I don't want this to feel like a monologue. I really want this to feel like a dialogue. And as much as I can, I'm going to engage you guys to be a part of this experience. This is an experience for all of us. Okay, this is our experience with the big book. This is our spiritual experience with the big book. So just by way of just kind of setting some context, my name is Kevin Olson. I am a recovered alcoholic. And what I mean by that when I say I'm a recovered alcoholic is that by the grace of God, that I have access through the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, my compulsion and my obsession to drink alcohol has been expelled. My sobriety date is February 18th of 2009, which means I'm about 15 and a half years sober right now. I live in Calgary, Alberta. My home group is the Primary Purpose Group of Calgary, Alberta, which is a meeting that I helped to found in about 15 years ago as well. And my sponsor's name is Alan Bernstein, for anyone who knows Alan. He is from the Pacific Group in Los Angeles, and his sponsor for 22 years was Clancy Immisland. And that's the sponsorship lineage that I come from. We have been doing this big book study for about 15 years. For many years, we did it in person at various different hospitals and stuff like that around town. COVID kind of necessitated that we move online, and never in a million years could I have guessed that we would be able to transmit the message just as brilliantly online as we do in person. And in fact, it's one of those things, the fear that I had when COVID first hit, that AA was going to be ripped apart. And instead, I would argue that we are more unified than we have ever been as a fellowship around the world. And if you just take a look around the call right now, we have people from all over the world on this call right now, all sharing in this big book together. And it's one of the coolest things I've ever been a part of. Super grateful to Steve Wood and Summer Heese for the Big Book Compendium and for having invited me to join them probably about 3 years ago since we moved online. So the basic foundation of this big book study is Joe and Charlie. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of a Joe and Charlie big book study. All right. Hey, if you have not done a Joe and Charlie big book study, do not go to sleep tonight until you found Joe and Charlie online. Now, in addition to Joe and Charlie, so I did the Joe and Charlie big book study. I was a student and continue to be a student of the big book for many, many years. I just learned something just yesterday. No, Sunday night, I learned something about the big book. The word sponsor is not in the first 164 pages of the big book. I had to go check. I couldn't believe that. And I couldn't believe that I didn't know that, but that's true. Anyway, just to say, I continue to learn about this book. And I studied Joe and Charlie for many years. I studied under a guy named Cowboy Ray here in Calgary. Some of you may know Cowboy Ray. Some of you may have studied with Cowboy Ray. He studied with Joe and Charlie as well, and that's where I learned a lot of this stuff. That said, in addition to Joe and Charlie, and in addition to the basic textbook of Alcoholics Anonymous, there will be, hey, Scott, how you doing? It's been a little while. Nice to see you. There will be some other stuff that I'm going to thread into this study. And one of the things I want to start out with, you guys see this whiteboard back here? Is that all right? How's the framing? Should I, is that good, Rob? Do you think? Does it look okay? If I write this.
Yep. Yeah, that'll be fine.
You guys see that?
Yep.
xa-speakers.org. Okay, and I always like to kind of start out talking about this particular website. You can go to YouTube as well. I'm pretty sure there's Joe and Charlie Big Book Studies on YouTube. If you want to know, who are these Joe and Charlie? Who are you guys talking about? Yeah, that's right. There was tapes for many, many years. Now they're all online. But in addition to xa-speakers.org, or rather, sorry, in addition to, I'll say Joe and Charlie, you guys are going to hear me talk about several other prominent members of AA, I'll say, and several other members that mean a lot to me over the course of this big book study. The first one of which would be my grand sponsor, Clancy I. Okay. So if you just go to this website, you can find all these guys. His sponsor was a man named Chuck Chamberlain. Anyone here ever heard of the book, A New Pair of Glasses? Raise your hand if you've heard of a New Pair of Glasses. Okay, Chuck Chamberlain wrote that book. You may hear me talk about, you can go on here and you can listen to Bill Wilson, our co-founder. You can go onto that website and you can listen to Evie, Thatcher. So all of these things are all going to come into play. All of these speakers, and for that matter, I'll say Polly P. For the ladies out there, I'll say Polly P. or Marilyn S. Great AA speakers. Okay, so you may hear me talk about any one or a number of these speakers, things that I've learned from these speakers, things that I have picked up on, things that have informed my sobriety, things that have informed my spiritual recovery. That's the book right there, Scott. That's the book right there, written by my great grand sponsor, Chuck Chamberlain. So in any event, guys, all of these speakers at various different points across this study, I'm going to share different stuff that's going to come from all those folks. The bottom line is the basic text of this AA Big Book study is, of course, going to be the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous. Towards the end of this study, I may also begin to introduce, particularly in steps 10 and 11, I will begin to introduce the 12 and 12. So have that ready when we get to steps 10 and 11. And so one of the things about this study, though, is that I don't ever put a cap on like how many weeks this study is going to be. Some people will say like, oh, it's a 14-week study, or it's a 16-week study, or however. I don't do that. I don't do that in this particular study. This study takes as long as it's going to take until we get to the end. And sometimes in particular, when we go through steps 4 and 5 or 8 and 9, in particular, when I begin to get very involved with you guys and get you guys really participating in that portion of your own recovery and that portion of the study, it can get deep, and we can go deep sometimes, and it can take some time to go through that properly. So I'm never going to say, here's how long the study is. Another thing that I like to point out is that there's no homework involved in this study. Different big book studies, raise your hand. Have you ever been a part of a big book study that had homework? You had to go home and do the work and then come back. Yeah, this study doesn't have any particular homework, okay? And for me, that homework was always really kind of intimidating. That homework was always kind of like, I got to go home and do the work. And then, you know what, guys, I wouldn't do it. And then I wouldn't do the homework because I'm a fallible alcoholic and I'm undisciplined, and I wouldn't do the homework. And then I would feel like I wasn't welcome at the big book study. Okay. I don't want anyone to ever feel that they're not welcome at this big book study. Okay. I do not care what you have or have not done over the last week. I just love you, and I just want you to be here at this study. Good things happen at this big book study. Miracles happen at this big book study. You just come. Okay, you just come. I don't care if you've done the homework, didn't do the homework, whatever it is. Okay. That said, I may ask you to get involved. Okay, there may be times where I have little pop quizzes. I may call you out. I may ask for, what do you think about this answer, Scott B? Or, hey, what do you think about this part of the book, Janice? Or whatever it might be. And as much as you can, try to participate. Okay, I promise you will be working with a safety net. I will not let you fall. Okay, I will not let you feel embarrassed or ashamed of yourself in this study. That will never happen. Okay, I promise you. Except for my sponsee Brad, I might do it to him, but other than that, only good things happen here. Okay, this is a very positive experience. And that's really why I started this big book study. That's really why we really do this study. I want everyone to have the experience that I have had with this miraculous book. I believe that this book is a spiritual vortex. Okay. I believe that when we open this book, God comes to us through this book. I firmly believe that. I believe that this book is a book, by the way, called Alcoholics Anonymous. For anyone who doesn't know, this book is not called the Big Book. This book is called Alcoholics Anonymous. Okay. And I believe that this book is the perfection of the program of AA. And that my job is to live my life in as close to, as in alignment to this book as possible. Okay. I strongly believe that. And I am one of those people that does believe that this book was divinely inspired. I believe because the guy who wrote this book was 4 years sober. The guy who wrote this book did not know enough to write this book. There is no chance that his pen was not guided by a force greater than himself. And I believe deeply in the power of this book. I like to think of myself as like a 1939 to 1940 member of Alcoholics Anonymous, when all that there was this book. This is all that was available. We used to be a book that grew into a fellowship. Seems to me today in a lot of places we are a fellowship that also happens to have a book once in a while. You guys with me on that? You know what I'm saying? Okay. And the folks that I work with, the guys that I sponsor, this is what we do, man. This is what we do. This is where we go. We go deep into this book. Then we take what we've learned in this book, and we take it to our meetings. Okay. I believe that I take my problems to my sponsor, and I take my solutions to meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous, not the other way around. How many times have I, in the past, I brought my problems to the meeting? I'm going to bring my little bag of problems to the meeting. No, I bring my problems to my sponsor. We sit down with this book and we solve those problems. And then I bring my solutions to the meeting. You guys with me on that? Okay. So one of the last things that I want to, and I promise we are actually going to read the big book tonight. I promise you. I promise you, we will get into the book. the last thing that I kind of want to share with you guys is something that Chuck Chamberlain, who wrote that book, A New Pair of Glasses, and thank you for showing that book, Scott. This is something that he talks about. And I want right out of the gate, at a foundational level at this study, I want you guys to always understand that this is the very root of this study. This is the foundation, okay, for everything that we're going to do in this study. And that is the transition that every alcoholic needs to make, transition that I need to make in AA if I'm going to recover from this seemingly hopeless disease. And that transition is a transition from being a taker to being a giver. Being selfish to being selfless. Okay? I'm making the transition from being a taker towards being a giver. And anyone here who is new or relatively new, just by the way, just out of curiosity, is there anyone here who is, say, in their first 30 days sober? Anyone at all? Okay, is there anyone here who would be like in their first year sober? Anyone at all? Hey, Benjamin, awesome, man. Awesome, great, glad to have you. Welcome, man, that's brilliant. Tom, were you saying hello or were you raising your hand for first year sober?
I've been in for over 2 years, but longest stretch of sobriety I've had is 10 months and 14 days.
Awesome. Well, I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you're here as well. Benjamin, it's great to have you. Lahai, am I saying that right? Lahai? Lahai?
Yeah, that's correct. Lahai.
Lahai, awesome to have you. Lahai, great to, really, I mean, you're the reason that we're here. You are the reason that we're here. And if you're here and you're new, I mean, what I always like to say is like, it's okay for you to be a taker while you're here and you're new. For about the next 15 minutes, you can be a taker, okay? And then eventually, right away, right out of the gate, we're going to expect you to start making this transition from being a taker to a giver. And this is foundationally where I start with my sponsees as well. When I start with them, I want them always to be thinking about, how am I going to take what I'm learning right now with the understanding that eventually their life is going to depend on carrying this message to another alcoholic. And I want them to understand that right out of the gate. It talks about that in the chapter Working with Others, that we communicate to this man that he's under no obligation to us. All that we ask is that he pass this on to someone else down the road. We set the stage with the newcomer right out of the gate, and that's what we need to do, and that's what we're doing here. Okay, so now there's another great AA speaker. Brad knows what I'm about to say. The great Scott Lee, great speaker named Scott Lee, Scott L. Don't go to sleep tonight if you've never listened to Scott L. Go to xa-speakers.org, put in Scott L. You will not be disappointed. What Scott L. likes to add to this is that during this transition from being takers to givers, at some point we have to become receivers. And how do we become receivers? Well, I believe there are 12 ways that we become receivers. Okay? We do this work. We do this work so we can become receivers, so we can become divine antennas for God's radio signal. Okay? And we become receivers. And then once we become receivers, once we're able to receive these things away, okay? Early on in my early sobriety, I had sponsors that would bring me little handfuls of water to keep me alive, but their ultimate job and what they did, thank God, was show me the river. They show me where to find the river, okay? And that is my sincere hope tonight and over the course of this big book study that we can all go find the river together, okay? You guys with me on that? You guys ready to rock and roll? All right, let's get into it. I want to just introduce a couple of people for anyone who doesn't know. First, Kay from Toronto is the man behind the scenes, the master of ceremonies, makes this a three-dimensional experience, and I love having you, Rob, and thank you very, very much for everything that you do. And secondly, I want to introduce my sponsee, My second in command, Brad Silito. Thank you. He broke his own anonymity on his Zoom there, so I'm not going to apologize for that. And Brad's going to be our reader tonight. So thank you, Brad, for everything you do for the study. There may be some weeks, guys, I travel a lot for work. There may be weeks that I miss. And whenever I do, I will always have it covered. It may be Brad, it may be another one of my sponsees, but we will be here every Tuesday night. There will be someone here for you every Tuesday night, okay? So with that said, guys, let's get into the book, and we're gonna start somewhere that I did not personally start when I first started reading the big book. Okay, when I first started reading the big book, I started on page 1, man. Okay, I don't read prefaces and forwards and things like that. Those are for losers. Okay, I started on page 1, and unfortunately for me, starting on page 1, I started right smack dab in the middle of Bill's story and had no idea what this guy was talking about. I had no idea what a Hampshire Grenadier or who Tom or Walter Hagen was, bathtub gin. I didn't understand any of it. And I just got frustrated and just wanted it to go away. And thank God for the men and women in Alcoholics Anonymous who sat me down and took me through this book line by line, word by word. And they started with me at the preface, right from the very, very, very beginning of this book, okay? And we're going to get into it. And one of the coolest things, guys, is going through this, I'm going to get to learn a little bit about the history of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I had such a profound change in my understanding of AA and the legacy and the heritage of where we come from. And AA is we're not even that old. Okay, we're not even that old. We're almost 90 years old. It's not that old, but the history and the legacy of who we are and where we come from and the heritage is being lost all the time. And it meant a lot to me to learn this stuff. Okay, and I hope it'll mean a lot to you as well. It also changed my understanding of what the true purpose of AA is. Okay, we're not just a not drinking society. Okay, there's more to it than that. So I needed to learn all of this stuff, and we're going to learn it as we read through the prefaces and the forward to the first edition, and we'll see how far we get into the forward to the second edition tonight. We won't push it too hard, but we'll see where we get to. In any event, over to you, Brad, page XI. That's Roman numeral 11. For anyone who didn't know, I had to learn my Roman numerals in AA. And here we go, Brad.
Thanks, Kevin. Hello, everybody. I'm Brad Silito. I'm a recovered alcoholic. As Kevin said, this is the preface. So this is the 4th edition of the book Alcoholics Anonymous. The first edition appeared in April 1939, and in the following 16 years, more than 300,000 copies went into circulation. The second edition, published in 1955, reached a total of more than 1,150,500 copies. The third edition, which came off press in 1976, achieved a circulation of approximately 19,550,000 in all formats.
Okay, so I just want to point out for anyone who's interested, April 10th, 1939 is the day the big book was published. April 10th, 1939. And I want you guys to pay attention to one number we just read, 300,000, okay? So between 1939, 1955, 300,000 copies of this book go out into the world, okay? And I just want you to be just mindful of that. Just hold on to that number for me, okay? We'll come back to it.
Because this book has become a basic text for our society and has helped such large numbers of alcoholic men and women to recovery, there exists strong sentiment against any radical changes being made in it. Therefore, the first portion of this volume describing the AA recovery program has been left largely untouched in the course of revisions made for the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th editions. The section called The Doctor's Opinion has been kept intact, just as it was originally written in 1939 by the late Dr. William D. Silkworth, our society's great medical benefactor.
So that was impressive to me when it was pointed out to me that the first 164 pages of this book have not changed and will likely never change. In order for that change to occur, I don't know if you guys know this, but there would have to be a vote, and 2/3 of all of the groups in North America, 2/3 of all of the groups would have to agree to make a change in the first 164 pages of the book, which virtually means it will never happen. But that is the mechanism. We could change it if we wanted to. 2/3 of every group, every known group, would have to change. It was impressive to me to find out that that it had not been changed and is not going to be changed. That said, we're going to be coming to a very interesting point in the history of Alcoholics Anonymous very soon, in November. Can anybody tell me what's happening in November? What's coming out in November? Does anybody know? Janice.
Well, that new book is coming out, but now that I'm on the spot, I forgot the name of it, but the new some simple language, I don't know, the simple big book, I don't know, something like that.
I believe they're going to call it the Plain
Like,
Language.
there it
Big
is.
Book.
Yes.
Rob, that's right, Rob. So the Plain Language Big Book is going to come out in November. I believe it's coming out coinciding with the 5th edition of the Big Book. Okay, so we are coming out to a real important turning point in the history of AA. Okay, and so I am trying to avoid contempt prior to investigation. I have been told by many people, maybe you should try reading the Plain Language Big Book before you start hating it, because I immediately started hating it. That's just me. I want you to develop your own opinion about it, but in any event, I can see why there is a need for this book, and I'm slowly becoming more open-minded to it. But the first 164 pages of this book, I believe, are sacred. And as some of you may know, in this study, we actually only work up to the first 96 pages, okay? And someone asked last time, why do you only do the first 96 pages, Kevin? And simply, it's because that's all that Joe and Charlie did. And that's what I know. I'm a one-trick pony. That's the stuff that I know. That's the stuff that I've taught for 15 years. At some point, maybe I'll go deeper into 2 wives and 2 employers and the family afterward. And I love the chapter of Vision for You. But anyway, all of that to say, the first 164 pages will never be changed. But it's a turning point in AA. The Plain Language Big Book is coming out. It will be available in November. I asked our delegate, just out of, I'll just mention this as information. I asked our delegate at a convention recently if we get to know who wrote the Plain Language Big Book. And the answer is absolutely not. We will never know. And we don't even get to know if the person who wrote the Plain Language Big Book is an alcoholic or not. And that's crazy to me. Thank you, Karen. I see Karen shaking her head. I'm with you, Karen. All right, but look, guys, this is just Kevin Olson's and Karen's opinion. Okay. But it doesn't mean that we're right. It doesn't mean that we're right. And I think that there's a place for this book. It's just interesting to me. It's a turning point. It's a new epoch in the history of Alcoholics Anonymous. And let's do everything that we can. I will do everything I can to keep this message vibrant and strong. I promise you guys, I will work my little neck off to make that happen. And I hope that you guys will as well. Okay, Brad, back to you.
The second edition added the appendices, the 12 traditions, and the directions for getting in touch with AA. But the chief change was in the section of personal stories, which was expanded to reflect the fellowship's growth. Bill's story, Dr. Bob's nightmare, and one other personal history from the first edition were retained intact. 3 were edited, and one of these was retitled. A new version of 2 stories were written with new titles. 30 completely new stories were added, and the story section was divided into 3 parts under the same headings that are used now. In the 3rd edition, part 1, Pioneers of AA, was left unchanged. 9 of the stories in part 2, They Stopped in Time, were carried over from the 2nd edition. 8 new stories were added. In part 3, They Lost Nearly All. 8 stories were retained, 5 new ones were added. The 4th edition included the 12 concepts for world service and revises the 3 sections of personal stories as follows. 1 new story has been added to part 1, and 2 that originally appeared in part 3 have been repositioned there. 6 stories have been deleted. 6 of the stories in part 2 have been carried over. 11 new ones have been added, and 11 taken out. Part 3 now includes 12 new stories. 8 were removed, in addition to the 2 that were transferred to Part 1. All changes made over the years in the Big Book AA members' fond nickname for this volume have had the same purpose: to represent the current membership of Alcoholics Anonymous more accurately, and thereby to reach more alcoholics. If you have a drinking problem, we hope that you may pause in reading one of the 42 personal stories and think, yes, that happened to me, or more important, yes, I felt like that, or most important, yes, I believe this program can work for me too.
Thanks, Brad. So yeah, so that's the only part of the book that changes is the stories, right? And when the 5th edition comes out, they've done a very, very thorough job of curating what stories were going to be added to the Big Book. And I just want to point out as well, something that I didn't mention was what type of a book this is. And it says it's our basic text. Okay, it's a textbook, and people really like to hammer this home, right? This is a textbook. It's meant to be studied. This isn't just read like a novel. But you know, I think for anyone who's ever done any school and had any textbook, you don't just study. I don't just study a textbook. Okay, I study it, and then I have to learn how to apply it into real world life and into real world situations. Okay, and I hope that that's part of what we will learn to do together in this study. I hope that you will find this study immensely practical and not just theoretical, not just academic. I will give you examples and stories and situations from my own life where I have applied the lessons of the Big Book, the textbook of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I've applied those lessons into real world situations, for better or for worse. Okay, I've made every mistake that a person can make in AA. Believe me, I've made almost every mistake in AA sober that I did when I was drinking. Okay, but I've learned how I can make those right again through the magic and the power of the 12 steps as taught to me through the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. So with that said, I think that's it, guys. So my kind of feeling on it tonight, what I want to do is we'll go through the forward to the 1st edition. We will briefly touch on the forward to the 2nd edition. I don't want to do a deep dive into the history tonight. So we may even finish up a little early tonight, because I don't want to start to unpack the history. One of two things will happen. Either I will do a poor job of the history, or we will be here till 7:45, and we don't want either one of those. So I'd rather do all of the history next week. But with that said, Brad, let's go into the forward to the 1st edition and see where we get to.
Forward to the 1st edition. This is the forward as it appeared in the first printing of the 1st edition in 1939. We of Alcoholics Anonymous are more than 100 men and women who have recovered from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. To show other alcoholics precisely how we have recovered is the main purpose of this book. For them, we hope these pages will prove so convincing that no further authentication will be necessary. We think this account of our experience will help everyone to better understand the alcoholic. Many do not comprehend that the alcoholic is a very sick person. And besides, we are sure that our way of living has its advantages for all.
So, you know, when I was growing up, we had a thing here in the province of Alberta. We had a thing here in Canada called ADAC. Anybody here ever heard of ADAC? You may have had something similar where you grew up, where it was a government-sponsored addiction thing. Okay, and the government would write books and have pamphlets and have cute little commercials on TV and all that kind of stuff, right? And I always thought that Alcoholics Anonymous was like somehow funded by the government. It was somehow funded by this ADAC, or was connected to it one way or another. Okay. And it wasn't until someone sat me down and explained to me in this forward to the 1st edition who actually wrote the Big Book. And the Big Book was written by the first 100 members of Alcoholics Anonymous. Now, Bill Wilson was holding the pen. That is true. Okay. But everything that he wrote was edited and revised by the first 100 members of Alcoholics Anonymous. And if you're relatively new, you may not have heard the term the first 100. But the first 100 in AA take on almost mythical status. It's almost like folklore. Okay, the first 100 members of Alcoholics Anonymous are the ones whose divine group conscience was the lightning rod for the Spirit of God into this spiritual vortex that we call the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous. And what Cowboy Ray taught me is that if I was going to argue with something in the Big Book, what I was really arguing with was not one man, but I was arguing with the first 100 members of Alcoholics Anonymous. Okay.
That's right.
And we believe that their collective wisdom, that their collective experience was a sacred thing. And I still believe that, a divine inspiration. That said, there wasn't actually 100 of them. There was not actually 100 members. Bill Wilson, he was a salesman, right? 100 just sounds better. He's gonna, what are you gonna say, 73? No, they're gonna say 73, right? They're gonna say 100, right? He's trying to sell this book, man. By the way, for anyone who doesn't know, I mean, that's how they got this book published. They sold shares to of a corporation called Works Publishing. They sold shares to one another. I've got a copy of, not an actual stock certificate, but a picture of one. So he was a salesman. He was trying to sell this book. So the first 100 members, there was 100 sober members between Akron, Ohio, and New York City. Okay, with a few in Cleveland. Okay, it was growing there little by little, but then they looked back and they thought, you know, we've got about 100 people between Akron and Cleveland and New York City, and they thought, you know what, we probably know enough that we ought to write a book. Anyway, so one of the things, and I've talked to a friend of mine about this a lot, and I always want to read the Big Book in context. I always want to imagine, and I like to imagine that I'm one man sitting alone in, you know, Middletown, USA, or Middletown, Canada, or Middletown, Australia, right, Kevin? Right? wherever, Middletown, okay? And a copy of this book lands with me, okay? And that's all that I've got. That's all that I've got. There's no meetings to go to. There's no sponsor. There's no treatment center. There is a book. And this book, this is how Alcoholics Anonymous was transmitted around the world. And that is an amazing thing to me. I know, you know, the story of how this book got to the city that I live in, Calgary. And I'll tell you what, you guys come back next week. If you can learn the story, you know, Bob Mazer, if you can find out, how did AA get to Warren, Ohio? Okay. Greg, Alto, how did AA get to Brooklyn? Kevin, how did AA get to Gympie, Australia? I'd love to hear that story. Okay. How did AA get to Quincy, Illinois? You can find these things out. I can tell you how it got to Calgary. A copy of this book. Okay. A copy of this book and nothing else, man. A copy of this book found its way up through Minnesota. And there were some guys in Winnipeg. The first AA in Canada landed in Winnipeg. The guys in Toronto don't like to admit that. Okay. But the first AA, right, Rob? But the first AA landed in Winnipeg. That's where it came. Okay. And a guy in Calgary named Jack Jensen had a brother who was alcoholic. And he wanted to get his brother sober, and he had heard about a copy of this book. Bill Law on the call right now. Bill, you've probably been to central office. You can, this story is well curated in Calgary central office. A guy named Jack Jensen. He didn't take his brother to a meeting. He didn't Google a treatment center. He didn't hire an interventionist. He didn't watch a YouTube video. He got a copy of a book. And this is all that it was, man. This is all that it was. You know, next week we're going to read about a spark that flared into Alcoholics Anonymous. And thank God for the early members of AA who took that little spark and built it into the fire that it is today. So that when I was ready to come to AA, There was 2 million people standing around a fire and they just said, yeah, kid, come on in, right? Easy, okay? But that guy, Jack Jensen, got a copy of this book, and that's how AA came to Calgary. He tried to get his brother sober. His brother did not get sober. His brother did not get sober. And as I understand, his brother died drunk, but Alcoholics Anonymous was born in Calgary. And that was, I want to say 44. Bill, I don't know. Do you know, Bill Law? Do you know what year that was? I think it was about 44 in that area. Anyway, guys, I think this stuff is magic. I think this is absolutely magical. And I hope if there's one thing I can share with you across, the history and the first couple of times that we're going to go through this together and some of this early history, I hope that you will feel some of the magic that I feel in the early history of Alcoholics Anonymous, particularly next week. Don't miss next week, guys. Come back next week because we're going to get into the absolute spiritual Disneyland we're going to be in next week, man. It's the best. It's the best. The early history of AA. In any event, Brad, back to you. Thank you.
It is important that we remain anonymous because we are too few at present to handle the overwhelming number of personal appeals which may result from this publication. Being mostly business or professional folk, we could not carry on our occupations in such an event. We would like it understood that our alcoholic work is an avocation.
Okay, so there's a lot of words in this book that I needed to learn. I need to know what they meant. Okay, avocation. Well, what does that mean? Our alcoholic work is an avocation. Well, a vocation, a lot of us might know what a vocation is. A vocation is a job. It's a job that you do that you get paid for. An avocation is the opposite of that. An avocation is work that we do not get paid for. And we'll talk about this more next week. Okay, this was beyond belief to the general public that these drunks were getting together and helping each other and there was no profit motive whatsoever. Yeah, right. Okay, this is during the Great Depression, guys. This is like 1935 to 1939. No chance. There's got to be an angle somewhere. There's got to be money involved somehow. And we'll talk about it next week. How it came to light that no, these guys are as real as they say they are. And we went in a span of 2 years, we went from 800 members to 8,000 members worldwide. And it just ballooned. Mushroomed is the word that they use. But that's an avocation. We would like it understood that our alcoholic work is an avocation. It's work that we do for the general goodness of other people that we do not get paid for. Back to you, Brad.
When writing or speaking publicly about alcoholism, we urge each of our fellows to omit his personal name, designating himself instead as a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. Very earnestly, we ask the press also to observe this request, for otherwise we shall be greatly handicapped. We are not an organization in the conventional sense of the word. There are
Sorry, Brad, I'm just gonna interject here. What you're gonna see here is the very first beginning formation of the 12 traditions. But I want you guys to understand that when they wrote the forward to the first edition, the 12 traditions did not exist yet. Okay, these are some of the early traditions that are already started to be hammered out between 1935, June 10th, 1935, when AA started, and April 10th, 1939, when the Big Book was published. These are some, but they weren't codified yet. They won't be codified until 1950 is when the 12 traditions were affirmed at the first international conference in Cleveland. Okay, and people hated them. People hated the traditions, which is part of why Bill wrote the 12 and 12 to try and sell the fellowship on the 12 traditions. The first thing I want to point out here is that it says we are not an organization in the conventional sense of the word. That's what Brad just wrote. And I like to use this as an example to talk about that tradition. Tradition 9, which is AA ought never be organized. Okay. What Bill Wilson means by that, when he says we are not organized in the conventional sense, is the strictest law definition of the word organized. He means we are not organized like a corporation. As in, we don't have a CEO and then a bunch of vice presidents, and then a bunch of middle managers, and so on. We're not organized like a corporation, okay? And we're not organized in the conventional sense of the word. Who is the boss in AA? G to the OD, baby. G Dizzle. G Dizzle is the boss. That is it, okay? He is the boss. And that is that, again, that as well was like beyond belief to people. That said, and this is a little call it a pet peeve, or my sponsor might call it a resentment, okay? But what will happen is, like, someone will forget to buy the coffee for the meeting, or someone will forget to pay the bill for the meeting, or someone will forget that the meeting starts at 7:30, not 8 o'clock, and the meeting starts late. And what's the first thing they're gonna say? AA ought never be organized. Garbage. AA does not say that I do not become an organized individual of society, and that I become a good citizen and a good example of this program in action. And I ought to be organized as a human being. AA, on the other hand, ought never be organized. We are never going to be organized in a conventional sense of the word, as in we are not a corporation. We have one boss, one ultimate authority, a loving God, as he may express himself through our group conscience, okay? Brad, if you want to keep reading, you'll see here how some of these early traditions began to be formed.
There are no fees or dues whatsoever. The only requirement for membership is an honest desire to stop drinking. We are not allied with any particular faith, sect, or denomination, nor do we oppose anyone. We simply wish to be helpful to those who are afflicted. We shall be interested to hear from those who are getting results from this book, particularly from those who have commenced work with other alcoholics. We should like to be helpful to such cases. Inquiry by scientific, medical, and religious societies will be welcomed. Alcoholics Anonymous.
Beautiful. Okay, let's slip forward to the second edition, Brad, and let's read. We'll go through, I think, just the first two paragraphs, and we'll probably end for tonight. But there's a couple things I want to point out about these paragraphs.
Okay, forward to the second edition. Figures given in this forward describe the fellowship as it was in 1955. Since the original forward to this book was written in 1939, a wholesale miracle has taken place. Our earliest printing voiced the hope that every alcoholic who journeys will find the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous at his destination. Already, continues the early text, 2s and 3s and 5s of us have sprung up in other communities. 16 years have elapsed between our first printing of this book and the presentation in 1955 of our second edition. In that brief space, Alcoholics Anonymous has mushroomed into nearly 6,000 groups whose membership is far above 150,000 recovered alcoholics. Groups are to be found in each of the United States and all of the provinces of Canada. AA has flourishing communities in the British Isles, the Scandinavian countries, South Africa, South America, Mexico, Alaska, Australia, and Hawaii. All told, promising beginnings have been made in some 50 foreign countries and US possessions. Some are just now taking shape in Asia. Many of our friends encourage us by saying that this is but a beginning, only the augury of a much larger future ahead.
Yeah, and they were right. They were absolutely right. So augury is like a premonition or an omen, or a forecasting of what's going to happen in the future. And they're absolutely right. By today's numbers, there are at any given point 2 million sober members of Alcoholics Anonymous around the world. And what's interesting to me, though, is that you can look at the numbers. The worldwide fellowship of AA, we plateaued at about 2 million in about 1982. 1982 to today, we plateaued at like 2 million. It ebbs and it flows. It'll go to like 1.8 million, it'll go to 2.2 million, and then it'll go back down to 1.9 million, and so on. But we've never really gotten above that 2 million mark. I've got a lot to say about that, and I'll probably say more about it next week. But the first thing I want to do, guys, is I just want to highlight something that I noticed. Between 1939, when the book is published, and 1955, you guys remember I asked you to point out to keep one number in mind. From 1939 and 1955, how many copies of the big book went out into the world? Anybody remember? Anybody? We just read it.
300,000.
There you go, Alana. Well done. 300,000 copies of the book. Okay. In that same time span, 300,000 copies of the book. Now, how many sober members of Alcoholics Anonymous are there? 150,000. What does that tell you? That success rates between 1939 and 1955 were 50%. 50% of people who came to AA immediately got sober and never drank again. 150,000 sober members of AA, 300,000 copies of the book. Now, the third edition, what does it say? 19,550,000 copies of the book. Where is everyone, man? Where is everyone? I think, and I will make the case this week and next, and probably several times over the remainder of this big book study, I will make the case that the problem with our fellowship is that we, since 1955, have begun paring our fellowship away from the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. There's several things that happen that never in a million years could they have guessed that these things would have actually a deteriorating effect on the impact of the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. I'll share some of those with you right now. I think now this is, again, guys, this is just Tuesday night big book study, Kevin Olson's opinion. But it's opinion that's been shared with me. I got my opinion, a lot of it from Cowboy Ray. And Cowboy Ray got a lot of his opinion from Joe and Charlie. So if that means anything to you. I think that the publishing of the 12 and 12 is one of the worst things that ever happened to Alcoholics Anonymous. I think you can make that argument, okay? And that it at least merits consideration. What happened in 1953, they released the 12 and 12. Why? Bill Wilson is trying to sell the fellowship on the 12 traditions. Okay, that's really, I think it's safe to say why he wrote it. He then bookends it with several essays that he wrote about the 12 steps. And don't get me wrong, I love the 12 and 12. It is beautiful, but it is written by one man. It is written by Bill Wilson. Yeah. It is written by Bill Wilson, 100%. Okay. And it is not written by the first 100 members of Alcoholics Anonymous. It's written by Bill. And the problem with the 12 and 12 is that they're brilliant essays and people love to read them, but there are no program of action in the 12 and 12. There are no directions on how to actually do the steps in Alcoholics Anonymous in the 12 and 12. And what our fellowship began to experience is a bunch of AA meetings where you would go, and what would they read? They would read the 12 and 12, and we would read these great essays, but there's no directions on how to actually do the steps. And if I'm not doing the steps, I don't just mean going to meetings and talking about the steps. I did that for years, brothers and sisters. I did that for years, walking in and out of meetings, watered down, middle of the road, half measures, 3-topic, disgusting meetings, talking about steps that I had never actually taken. And that I think has a lot to do with why we got away and why we see these numbers so closely resembling, in parallel to the number of big books, the number of sober recovered alcoholics, because in 1939 to 1955, there was nothing else to do. There was nothing else to do but read the big book, do the steps, with your sponsor and then immediately go carry the message to someone else. There was nothing else to do. There was no Alano Club. There was no AA dances. There was no, none of the other great stuff that we see around the fellowship. That is what, when we kept close to the book, we stayed close to recovery. Okay. In 1953, 12 and 12 comes out, and I think we started to get pulled away from the message. The other thing that happens in 1955 is that the American Psychiatric Association and American Medical Association diagnosed alcoholism as an actual disease, which we thought was going to be a great thing. Unfortunately, the net effect of that is that insurance companies started to get involved and corporations started to get involved. And that had a deteriorating impact on Alcoholics Anonymous as well. I believe over the years, in terms of our ability to get people sober in AA through the action of the 12 steps and getting connected to God as a result of the action taken in this book. Okay. And the Big Book Compendium exists. And this Big Book study exists because there are some of us who believe that the magic is in this book, and that if I stay connected to what is in this book, I will be able to continue to carry this message to other people, and we will be given the power through God to save lives. And I've seen it happen. I've seen it happen in my life. I've seen it happen to dozens and dozens and dozens of guys that I sponsor. And we will be backed up. This information will be backed up by some of the other stuff that we're going to read here in a little while. But I always like to point that out. Okay. 300,000 copies of the book, 150,000 sober members of Alcoholics Anonymous. Okay. I don't think you can argue with that. And we'll see some more percentages next week when we come back. So that said, guys, I'm going to end it there. I love you all. Thank you all for joining.